Hi investigators, Mike Evans from the Australian Security Academy with this week's riveting episode of Spy Curious, what's been happening in the investigation industry in Australia this week. Now, as you know, each week I bust my guts with 3 hours in hair and makeup on Friday morning prior to this program, 40 hours of rehearsals before I come on and do this program, and I just go for it to try and give everything I possibly can and demonstrate that I am a licensed private investigator. And last week, in my most popular watched show that I've ever done, where the microphone didn't work properly and we had feedback and double voices and all that sort of thing, and I was trying to appear as if I was a genuine, credible, licensed private investigator, I actually achieved it. I finally got there by numbers watching, and also because I had a private investigator haircut, and somehow that happened and coincided with last week. So what's been happening, people, this week in investigations? Well, at Investigations Uni, which you can see up in the right-hand side in the logo, which is the wrong logo, and I'm going to have to adjust that. We'll just jump over here to Spy Curious, where we're supposed to be. In Investigations Uni today, we have had surveillance for psychological and psychiatric injury, and the people that watch that and complete the quiz can go and get their statement of completion for that. In relation to that, that was 2 hours ago. We've been doing a lot of training today, and we've also had non-competitive agreement training for surveillance. So what you have to do when you've got a corporate client who's got a former employee going out and getting their clients to change over to the other side. So that's a business loss situation, and a really great program today we had with our non-competitive agreement surveillance, which is a really common form of surveillance. And as people found out that we're in that today, the most common people who breach non-competitive agreements by industry are lawyers. That's pretty freaky. You'd think it'd be someone else, but lawyers are the most common ones, and they don't get caught by surveillance. They get caught by the clients contacting their lawyer who's at that firm and saying, well, has George switched firms? Why was he ringing me, offering me a $5 discount per hour on his legal work, and said he was working for somebody else? So that's how they find out about that. They don't genuinely put the lawyers under surveillance because they work in offices and stuff like that. It's more your salespeople and your people that are out running around. So watch Jerry Maguire, you'll get the idea. Also, next week, coming up in the same thing, we've got CT liability injury surveillance. So that will be on next week in Investigations Uni. This week's been a really big week in Queensland. Since 1971, they have not changed the rules on recording devices, so surveillance devices and listening devices. 52 years in Queensland, they've had the same rules. Now, basically, they haven't had a real lot of trouble with it. Just 2 private investigation agencies in Queensland using coercive control came to the attention of the Women's Safety Council and were named, but the Office of Fair Trading's done nothing about it, right? And as a result of that, they are now cracking down on the use of surveillance devices, listening devices and trackers and all that sort of thing. And so they should be when it's marital and relationship surveillance investigators who are doing the wrong thing. Now, what I've done this week is I've told everybody, right, that there are 904 licensed private investigators in Queensland. You know that because you're a regular watcher of this program. And of those 904 investigators, seriously, 700 of them plus wouldn't know how to start a surveillance operation because all they do is factual investigations for workers' compensation, home and contents, general insurance, stolen motor vehicles, home arsons, home burglaries, break-into steals, public liability, slips, trips and falls, and code of conduct investigations. That's all they do. They don't use cameras as a surveillance device, and we're being lumped into a collective saying that everybody's doing the wrong thing when it's less than 20 and probably more likely only 12 licensed investigators in Queensland that are doing the wrong thing. The Office of Fair Trading have got it totally wrong. For a long time now, the Office of Fair Trading have been a lame duck regulator. Now in Victoria and New South Wales and South Australia, Tasmania, Western Australia, they regulate. My word, they do it. If you do the wrong thing as a licensed private investigator, you're out. Goodbye, gone, license taken off you, business gone. Go and sell real estate, mate. Right, that's what happens. But in Queensland, of the recent late couple of years, they've gone into sleep mode where you don't do anything that could be politically controversial, might lose a vote. So the Office of Fair Trading have not been regulating. And now the Women's Safety Council have come out and said, well, these private investigators are using coercive control as if it's 904 licensed private investigators, and it's not that, it's mostly 20 and could only be 12, right? That's all, right? It's been quite damaging for the reputation of our industry and its important worth to the economy of Queensland and to the businesses that are heavy users of licensed private investigators, mainly corporations, insurers and government departments like in Queensland, the MAIC, the CTB liability insurer, and the workers' compensation insurer, WorkSafe. So, this is something that we're not swallowing as Queensland investigators, that someone can come out and say all investigators are guilty because of what 12 dodgy ones do. All right. So you only see the headlines of the bad ones. That suits newspapers, it sells them, suits TV programs, sells those, gets you watching on the TV. So that is the situation in Queensland. Office of Fair Trading are not regulating. So let's have a look at a little video I made this week in relation to it. Give you a bit of a guess what they want to do, the Queensland Law Society. They want to bring in a commissioner about this to decide cases of inappropriate use of listening devices and surveillance devices. Now we know from last week, we looked at IBAC and how they don't regulate anything. All they do is they come on TV and get in the newspapers and say, oh no, that's out of our remit. That doesn't cover our legislation. Everybody expects them to do something about corruption in the public service. And yeah, they get a few soft wins, but when it comes to hard stuff, they go, oh no, the legislation, no, sorry, we don't do that. And I'm not having it either, because they want to pay a commissioner $250,000 a year to work 20 weeks a year, right? And then when that commissioner gets a case in front of them, they go, oh no, that's an unlawful legislation. I want the Office of Fair Trading to actually enforce what they're there for and not spend 250 grand on a bloke working 20 weeks a year, 18 hours a week, right? It's not going to happen. Let's have a look at the video.
The Queensland Law Reform Commission want to implement a commissioner for surveillance and listening devices to hear complaints and disputes. Well, the investigation industry in Queensland doesn't want that expensive and lacklustre idea. The licensed private investigator industry wants an empowered Office of Fair Trading to eliminate investigators who support and implement coercive control. The solutions the industry have are less expensive and work better for those who support coercive control. Oversight commissions such as IBAC and ICAC spend more time providing legislative act excuses as to why they cannot act or enforce, therefore expectations of what they are paid to do and exist for are never met, nor does the state get justice, industry results or value from them. We do not want an overpaid fat cat commissioner who only works 20 weeks a year and does nothing to fix the issues of coercive control in the investigation industry.
So the Queensland Law Society are asking you for your input into this. Now, if you go back to last week's Spy Curious program, I've given you the address and the email address who you can write to. You don't have to be a member of an industry association that doesn't represent you. Put in what you think. They've got a form to fill out, or you can just send them an email and say, listen, I'm not interested in your surveillance devices legislation and having a whole lot of paperwork to fill in and having a code of conduct and having all my agreements with my clients shown to you when I don't do marital and relationship surveillance, which is the problem that you've got here to deal with, and you're telling me I do that. What would you do if I said all politicians are crooks? Well, they're not, okay? And not all private investigators are either. So have your say, get in there. One of the issues that they're talking about in the Queensland law reform in regard to surveillance devices and listening devices is consent. Consent to be under surveillance. Nobody's going to consent to that unless they're on crutches in a neck brace 24/7, right? They'll happily do that. But consent isn't just on someone who's out in the field with an injury. There's a whole range of big issues with private investigators and what they do and consent. Mike Evans from the Australian Security Academy, and today I'm looking at the Queensland Law Reforms Commission invitation for submissions on surveillance devices, listening devices and trackers. Basically, since 1971, the legislation in Queensland's never changed. It's illegal to use trackers in every other state and territory practically, but in Queensland it's not illegal to do that. And a very small number, less than 20 of the 904 licensed private investigators in Queensland have been using tracking devices, listening devices, remotely operated cameras. And we know that because the Women's Safety Council of Queensland have had 2 submissions in relation to coercive control and the use of those devices. Now, the Queensland Office of Fair Trading knows who those investigators are, has done nothing about it because they're underfunded and understaffed. In the Office of Fair Trading, in the people that regulate it now, they're lovely people from a non-English speaking background, and it's wonderful they've got a job. They've got university degrees and no real world experience or understanding of what a licensed private investigator does. So when you go to them and say, look, we've got this issue, they look at it in terms of their understanding of never having walked down the street and spent their whole life in the university lectures, going, well, you know, that doesn't fit our remit on our legislation or our act. So they handball it, duck shove it, and don't understand what they're doing. Less than, 20 years ago, you would have had people in the Office of Fair Trading who were enforcement officers, funded, and knew what they were doing. And they could have gone out and stopped that, and they had the power and the understanding to do it. It would not have been tolerated. Today, the people in the Office of Fair Trading are just going through the motions with a quick handball of it over to somewhere else, which they don't even suggest. In May 2023, a licensed private investigator in Queensland was taking a class of compliance enforcement officers for a local council. During that class, that licensed private investigator, for an exercise as their teacher, got them to move away from their desks, get down on the floor and do an exercise. While they were on the floor, laying there or kneeling there or whatever they were doing, that licensed private investigator went round behind them without their knowledge or consent and took photographic images of them on the floor. Now, the majority of the people on the floor were female. They were kneeling. They were laying on the floor. They had skin exposed. One lady was kneeling in front of a seated male, and that image was taken. I don't know whether it was a mobile phone or a hidden camera, whatever, but it was without the knowledge or consent of anyone in the class at the time. Now, this is the issue. You got an ex-cop, licensed private investigator, taking photographic images of ladies in a classroom, and then he goes and posts them on social networking. And he tags in it his employer, and in one case, the head investigator of the Brisbane City Council names him and tags him with his name. Now, what's wrong with that? Well, I guess you'd have to ask the ladies, because no knowledge, no consent. They had no opportunity to prepare or present themselves for that photo. It was done without their permission. It's a classroom where they have to, on behalf of their employer, pass the Certificate for in Government Investigations course to remain employed. It's in their contract. They have to do that within a year. Now, if they kick up a fuss about their teacher taking photos of them from behind without their knowledge and consent and posting them on the internet without their consent, they fail the course. In vocational education and training, they have a word for it. It's called a power imbalance. A very powerful teacher with the ability to pass or fail you can do whatever they like. Nothing new. I guess it's been happening for years. The local council were aware of it. They're all ex-cops in the council's oversight department. An ex-cop took the photos, an ex-cop posted them on the internet. The victims in the case whose images were posted did not give their consent. They had no knowledge of it. The photographs were then replaced. The post remained the same, but the photographs were replaced with group photos of the classes. Now think about this. In at least 2 and possibly 3 local government councils in Queensland, there is a reference to consent for photographs being taken of the class in May of last year, 2022. Was that consent given prior to the class being conducted? Was that consent given immediately after the oversight committee of the councils, who are all ex-police officers who have to investigate code of conduct issues in local councils, right? Was it decided immediately after they became aware of it? Why didn't they tell the staff who appeared in those photos, whose images were put up on the social networking without their knowledge or consent, that it had happened? They didn't tell them that. It's a workplace health and safety issue, among other things, because if their husband or boyfriend finds out, if you see some of the photos, if they found out what was there, they'd get quite angry and be in the council and be demanding answers. So apart from the moral issue, there's the workplace health and safety issue as well. So the Queensland Law Reform Commission want to know is when, if at all, would it be appropriate to prescribe by regulation additional circumstances in which the use, installation, maintenance of surveillance device without consent is not an offence? Well, at least 2 local council oversight committees have documented that, and they're ex-cops. The licensed private investigators who actually do licensed private investigation work in Queensland, and they don't do marital and relationship surveillance, are being lumped in with the people that do what that trainer did at those 3 local councils. We don't want anything to do with it. Why should we have extra compliance activities lumped on top of us when we comply and these ones don't? And the 2 that were doing coercive control got away with it. The Office of Fair Trading did nothing. The Women's Safety Council were powerless. And this guy's gone and taken these images of these people with whatever device without their knowledge or consent and posted it on social media. Nothing's happened. And all the paperwork inside the councils will be perfect because it's ex-cops investigating ex-cops. It's a frightening power imbalance when you have to shut up to pass a course and do what your instructor says. It's not appropriate to have additional regulation to say we're enabling that in Queensland. The solution is simple. Get the Office of Fair Trading back on its feet with funding and human resources. Real inspectors with real powers that can go into an investigation agency and say, look, mate, you've been using surveillance devices inappropriately. We're taking your license off you. It's there on the internet. Okay, that's been changed, but you've got the photos here in your file. So consent is a nightmare issue. It's not just black and white as it's being played out to be by the Queensland Law Reform Commission, because someone comes up with a new and creative way of doing the wrong thing without people's knowledge or consent. You can't legislate against that. You can only enforce by a properly funded, appropriately qualified, independent of the councils or state government or federal government Office of Fair Trading Inspector enforcing compliance. I'm Mike Evans from the Australian Security Academy. Some of the other issues they're trying to do through the Office of Fair Trading in Queensland is through an industry association. They're trying to seek copies of your client contracts. So what you make a client sign when you do independent corporate work or individual work. Well, I don't know why you'd hand that over to an industry association. The investigation industry in Queensland has had standard operating procedures since 2020. And it was more like 2019, but it was early 2020 when they became freely available to anybody who wanted them. So it's the AIPI that have come out and said that as part of their consultation with the Office of Fair Trading, they want to see those engagement agreements and they want to have a code of conduct. Well, all the investigation agencies already have a client service level agreement that they comply with. They have to show Allianz, Suncorp and QBE how they store their information, their recordings, their videos, their reports, all that sort of thing. And they go through all the hoops and there's a myriad of checks and balances. But there's no checks and balances on the less than 20 private investigators who do marital and relationship investigation and use trackers and use listening devices. Now, there are people who are licensed private investigators in Queensland that don't use listening devices, trackers, and remotely controlled cameras. They don't. They never will. They never have. This is just a few, less than 20, more like 12 investigators that are doing that. So some of the jobs this week, people, what's happening? Lee Kelly and Associates are looking for a licensed private investigator down in New South Wales. Been around forever, Lee Kelly. The Senior Investigator for WorkSafe Victoria is required down in Victoria. You have to have a certificate for a government investigation to get that role. It's not a licensed private investigator role. A lot of licensed private investigators join WorkSafe Victoria because of their experience in workers' compensation investigation and enforcement. A loss adjuster is required by ProCare in Sydney, Newcastle, Maitland and the Hunter. So they're after several loss adjusters down at ProCare. G'day everyone at ProCare, hope you're well. Good to see you looking for loss adjusters. So that's great opportunity with ProCare. SureFact are looking for investigators who are licensed in Victoria and New South Wales. Now they want you to have 2 years investigation experience. They're looking for people that have been around. Now I can honestly tell you now that the beginners of last year have rocketed up the scale in investigations all around Australia. And the beginners from the year before have equally rocketed up the scale. And you might think I'm emerging, I'm only a beginner, I shouldn't apply for this. I'm saying to you now, if you're an Australian Security Academy student who has been taking part and participating in Investigations Uni with our psychological and our psychiatric injury surveillance, our what else have we been doing? Our non-competitive agreement surveillance, our records of interview, next week our CTP liability. You've been getting your CPD points from our stolen motor vehicle fraud investigations, from our fraud engines and the claims process of 5 weeks ago, and the record of interview, and you've got your nationally recognised qualification and your licence. Get in and apply with SureFact, because SureFact will give you a hearing. They'll listen to you. They want to know your licence and they want to know where you live. And if they've got a demand in Bourke, and that's where you live, or near enough to Bourke, you'll get a go with SureFact and they will onboard you and raise you. So don't be scared of the 2-year requirement. If this was 6 years ago, they would have been saying 5 years. But I'm sorry, there's very few with 5 years experience around at the moment because of COVID, and a lot of people just elected to retire and move on. It's an older person's game, and that's what's happened. It's happened in a lot of industries. It's not exclusive to investigation. Good on you, SureFact. G'day, Pat. G'day, Paul. G'day, everyone at SureFact. Investigator for the Professional Standards Unit is required by the Chief Minister of Treasury and Economic Development down in the ACT. That again, Certificate for in Government Investigations is what you'll be required to get that job. A Law Enforcement Conduct Commission in Sydney want the surveillance officer to do surveillance on police. Well, that's an interesting one. You get even with the cops. So that's a job you can get that's currently available. Now, where do you see these jobs? All of these jobs are on our Australian Security Academy Facebook page, which somehow I've deleted. So if you just go to Facebook and type in Australian Security Academy Facebook job vacancies, investigator job vacancies, you'll see those jobs there. Interesting one down in Melbourne today, a man who's drugged and raped a woman 67 times. He's used some kind of horse tranquilizer or whatever creeps use to knock out his victims. He's got 28 years in jail. Well done, Victorian Police. Good work. He is a 38-year-old man, so he's going to be 66 when he comes out, if he makes it at all. But that's happened today in the news on investigations around Australia. So today, people, we have been doing stolen motor vehicle investigations at Investigations Uni. And you can see there, we talked about the fraud triangle and how that works. We've been assisting the Queensland Law Reform Commission to make intelligent decisions, not knee-jerk reactions, and to fund the OFT in Queensland. So we've been doing all that sort of thing. And just as one last thing, this is what we want as licensed private investigators in 2023. The regulatory authority, the Office of Fair Trading, through funded human resources and empowered real on-the-street compliance enforcement inspectors, should be enforcing compliance with the Queensland Security Providers Act 1993. We don't need a toothless code of conduct. We don't need an expensive do-nothing commissioner on $250,000 a year working 20 hours a fortnight, making duck-shove decisions about what they can't do because of the legislation. We want everyone that are less than 20, more like 12 PIs in Queensland who have undertaken coercive control via trackers, listening devices and remote cameras. We want them named, located, their licences taken off them, the Office of Fair Trading enforcing the Act on the transgressors, and leave the 880 or more licensed investigators who don't do marital and relationship surveillance alone to get on with their worthwhile investigation work. Victoria, Tasmania, New South Wales, South Australia and the Western Australian Licensing Authority all enforce their acts. There is no reason the Queensland Office of Fair Trading cannot rebuild, start enforcing and move forward. A little bit of a reshuffle and a little bit of getting on with what they're supposed to do. That's what they're being paid to do. So that's the Licensed Private Investigator Weekly News for the week ending 12th of May 2023. You've been watching Spy Curious, episode 210. Last week's program was a really popular one. It's more popular than ever, and I can guarantee that this one is going to be 10 times more popular. Thanks for watching. Have a great investigation week. Happy Mother's Day to all the mums out there. Hope you enjoy your day. Don't go on surveillance on Sunday. Take it off. All right. See you next time, next week on Spy Curious. I'm Mike Evans from the Australian Security Academy. as usual, every week we go out with our usual way, which I can't resist because I just like it so much. It's a great way to end the week. And it's from the movie Cold Eyes. If you ever get an opportunity, 3/4 of that movie is really worthwhile for licensed private investigators. Drags a lot in the end, but if you ever get a chance to see this movie, you'll know why I like it so much. And I can't resist, just keep on playing.
확진자를 잡았습니다. 작전 종료. 전원 복귀할 것.
That's mission complete for this week in episode 210 of Spy Curious, the Australian Investigator Weekly News, where we hold people to account. Well done, private investigators. See you next week.